Welcome to today's deep dive.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited for this one.
Yeah, me too. I want to start off today by addressing you directly right where you are listening to this.
Yeah, just think about the last time you were scrolling through your newsfeed.
Or watching a broadcast.
Yep.
And you saw those really devastating headlines about global famine.
Or overpopulation.
Exactly. Or environmental collapse. If you are anything like me, you probably felt this overwhelming sense of guilt.
And anxiety.
Yeah, or just profound helplessness. You look at those images of parched earth and crowded slums and you just think,
There are just too many of us.
right, there simply isn't enough to go around. But if you have ever felt that way, this deep dive is designed specifically for you.
It is.
Because it's designed to completely shatter that entire perspective.
Which is a massive promise to make right out of the gate.
It is.
But the source material we are unpacking today absolutely backs it up. We are looking at an Arabic translation of a truly groundbreaking, paradigm-shifting book.
Titled The Manufacturing of Hunger.
Right, which is also known in English as Food First, Beyond the Myth of Scarcity.
And it was written by Francis Moore Lappé and Joseph Collins.
And the specific version we are referencing was translated by Ahmed Hassan.
And I think it's important to note, this isn't just a book about farming.
No, not at all. It is a total teardown of everything we think we know about how the world feeds itself.
So the mission of this deep dive today is to unpack the mechanics of global hunger. We are going to investigate the author's bold and frankly astonishing claim that food scarcity is a manufactured illusion.
It is not a natural inevitability.
Right. It is not some grim numbers game of human beings versus available acres of dirt.
But to really understand how radical this idea is, we have to look at the narrative we've all been sold for decades.
Right. The lifeboat concept.
Exactly. There is this concept called lifeboat ethics. It was popularized by an ecologist named Garrett Hardin back in the 1970s.
And the idea is simple, intuitive, and absolutely terrifying.
Hardin argued that the Earth is a lifeboat. It has a strict maximum capacity.
So if you are in the lifeboat and you see dozens of drowning people in the water...
Human instinct says you should pull them in.
Right.
But Hardin says if you try to save every single drowning person, the lifeboat gets too heavy. It swamps, it sinks, and absolutely everyone perishes.
Therefore, according to this ethic, the only rational moral choice for the survival of the human species is to row away and let those people drown.
It is an incredibly grim philosophy.
It really is.
It forces this mindset of absolute ruthlessness, disguised as pragmatism. It tells you that empathy is a luxury we literally cannot afford.
But here's how the source material immediately counters it. The primary thesis of Lappé and Collins is that the lifeboat isn't sinking because there are too many people in it.
The lifeboat is sinking because a tiny fraction of the passengers are hoarding all the supplies.
They are taking up all the room with their luxury cargo.
Exactly. And actively swatting away anyone in the water who tries to fish for their own survival.
And the authors present a view where food is not just daily calories.
No, they argue that food is the ultimate litmus test of an economic and social system's justice.
Right. Whether a society can feed its people is the baseline metric of whether its systems are functioning equitably.
If people are starving, the system isn't overwhelmed. The system is broken by design.
Okay, let's unpack this, because that is a heavy accusation. They are saying scarcity is an illusion.
Right.
But when you look at the raw data they present, the lifeboat analogy completely falls apart.
It really does.
Here is a staggering statistic from the text that I had to read 3 times just to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding it. Right now, globally, the world produces enough grain to provide 3,000 calories a day for every single man, woman, and child on Earth.
And we need to emphasize exactly what that number represents.
Yeah, break that down.
That 3,000 calories is just from grain?
Just grain.
Wheat, rice, corn. That does not even count the calories we produce from fruits. It doesn't count vegetables, beans, nuts, root crops like potatoes or cassava.
It doesn't count grass-fed meats or dairy.
Right. 3,000 calories of just grain is more than the average person in Western Europe or the United States consumes daily in total.
Wow.
So physically, materially, on a purely biological level, there is absolutely no scarcity. The food exists right now.
Wait, I have to stop you there because the math doesn't seem to make sense initially. If we have 3,000 calories a day in grain alone for every single person on the planet, why on earth are 500 million people starving or suffering from severe malnutrition? Where is all that food going? It can't just be vanishing into thin air.
It's not vanishing, it's being redirected. And that brings us to how land and food are actually used, and more importantly, who controls them.
Okay.
The text points out that the global underutilization of land is a massive factor that completely contradicts the whole "we're running out of room" narrative.
Because according to the data in the book, we are currently only farming about 44% of the world's cultivable land.
Less than half.
It's less than half. And furthermore, in developing nations, agricultural yields, the amount of food you get per acre, could easily double before they even reach the average yields currently seen in industrialized nations.
The physical potential for abundance is staggering. We aren't even close to capping out the Earth's capacity.
So if we are only using 44% of the land and the yields are only half of what they could be, the obstacles to reaching that potential clearly aren't physical.
No, they aren't about bad soil or a lack of rain or some inherent limit of nature. They are social and political obstacles.
The book references a study of 83 countries, and the concentration of land ownership they found is just shocking.
It really is.
In these 83 countries, just 3% of landowners control 79% of the land.
Let that sink in for a second for everyone listening. 3% of the people control almost 80% of the earth that can actually grow food. What's fascinating here is that this massive concentration of ownership directly causes underproduction.
How so?
Well, from a purely capitalist perspective, you would think these massive landowners would be maximizing every single inch of their property for profit.
Right. You'd think they would be squeezing every grain of wheat out of that dirt.
But the text argues the exact opposite is true. These massive estates are incredibly unproductive.
They cite Colombia in 1960 as a prime example, right?
Yes. The largest landowners there controlled 70% of all the agricultural land in the country.
Okay.
But they only actually cultivated 6% of it.
6%. So scarcity is created when land is monopolized not to grow food, but for social prestige.
Or as a speculative financial investment. It's like holding on to an empty lot in a booming city. You don't build on it, you just wait for the value to go up.
And when a few people hold the land as a status symbol, it sits idle while millions of landless peasants go hungry right next door. But even when the land is used, the book highlights a massive systemic misuse of resources. It's not just sitting empty. It's actively being diverted away from growing staple foods for local populations, and instead used to grow luxury export crops.
Right. The authors point out that in Central America and the Caribbean, up to 70 to 80% of children in some rural areas suffer from malnutrition.
They are visibly starving.
Yet, in those very same regions, 50% of their absolute best, most fertile agricultural land is used to grow export crops for the global north.
We are talking about land in places like the islands of Guadeloupe and Martinique,
where 66 to 75% of all cultivable land is dedicated to sugarcane, cocoa, and bananas.
These aren't crops you can survive on. These are dessert commodities for wealthy nations.
And it is not just the Caribbean. The scope of this is global.
The book talks about Thailand, where vast amounts of agricultural land are used to grow cassava, but it's not being grown to feed the Thai people.
No, it's being exported to Europe to be used as cheap livestock feed for European cattle.
Think about that pipeline. In Brazil, it's a similar story. A quarter of all their cropland is used to grow corn, but a third of that corn goes straight to feed livestock, often to produce meat for export.
We are quite literally taking the caloric potential out of the soil in developing nations, skipping the local populations entirely to feed cattle in wealthier nations so people can have cheaper hamburgers.
Which brings us to a really powerful, detailed case study in the text. Bangladesh.
If there is one country that has been used as the ultimate poster child for overpopulation, it's Bangladesh.
Oh, absolutely. Bangladesh is so often stereotyped in the media, especially back in the 70s and 80s. It's routinely painted as this hopeless basket case of overpopulation.
The narrative is always, look at this country, roughly the size of England and Wales, but packed with 80 million people, at least at the time the book was written.
The sheer assumption from Western commentators is that they have simply bred themselves into starvation. There are just too many mouths and not enough dirt.
It's the lifeboat ethic perfectly applied.
But the text dismantles that stereotype completely, and the math they use is undeniable.
The authors reveal that Bangladesh actually produces enough grain internally to give everyone in the country 2,300 calories a day.
The land there is incredibly fertile. It has a tropical climate, abundant water, and deep, rich alluvial soil.
Which is key.
Hold on. For those of us who aren't agronomists, what exactly makes alluvial soil so special? Why does that matter?
Alluvial soil is essentially the gold standard of dirt. It is nutrient-rich sediment silt, and clay that is naturally deposited by flowing rivers, especially during flood seasons. Bangladesh sits on the delta of three massive river systems, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, and the Meghna. Every year, these rivers flood and deposit fresh, incredibly fertile soil across the plains.
So it means the land is constantly regenerating its nutrients.
It is naturally primed for massive continuous crop yields without even needing expensive chemical fertilizers. It is an agricultural powerhouse.
So it's basically a natural food factory. And despite producing 2,300 calories per person on this incredible soil, the book states that over half the families in Bangladesh consume less than 1,500 calories a day.
And two-thirds of the population suffers from severe protein and vitamin deficiencies.
So I have to ask, if the food is literally growing all around them, if they are surrounded by rice paddies producing abundance, why aren't they eating it?
Because of the economic structure. The book describes an incredibly vicious debt trap mechanism that keeps the people starving while they're drowning in the food they grew.
Let's walk through how this actually works for a peasant farmer.
You have poor tenant farmers who do all the grueling, back-breaking work of planting, tending, and harvesting the rice.
Right.
But because they do not own the land they work on, because of that concentrated land ownership we talked about, they have to hand over more than half of their entire harvest to absentee landlords just for the privilege of working the soil.
Okay, so right off the top, 50% of their food is gone. They don't get to eat it. They don't get to sell it. It just goes up the chain to someone who probably lives in a city and has never touched a plow.
Precisely. And because the farmers are left with so little, what they retain is never enough to survive into the next harvest. Their own food runs out halfway through the year.
So to keep their families from starving, they have to borrow food or money from local merchants?
And the interest rates, the test reports, are predatory to a degree that is hard to fathom. We are talking about interest rates ranging from 50 to 200% for a short-term loan.
200%. So play this out. It's harvest time again. The farmer brings in the crop. What happens?
At harvest, the farmer has a field full of rice, but a ledger full of debt. And because every single farmer in the region is harvesting at the exact same time, the local market is suddenly flooded with rice.
Supply goes up, so the market price of rice completely plummets.
The farmers, who are desperate to pay off these 200% interest loans, are forced to sell whatever tiny portion of the crop they have left after paying the landlord.
But they have to sell it at rock-bottom harvest prices.
The merchants buy it up for pennies. The farmer pays off their debt, but now they have no food and no money, and the cycle immediately starts over.
They sell low, they buy high, and they are perpetually trapped. And the merchants and the hoarders know exactly what they're doing. This isn't an accident of the market, it's a feature.
The book mentions the horrific 1974 famine in Bangladesh to highlight this.
While people were literally dying of starvation in the streets, the authors note that hoarders had stockpiled an estimated 4 million tons of rice.
They simply locked it away in warehouses.
Why?
Because they knew the starving majority couldn't afford their inflated prices, and if they released it, the price would drop. They preferred to let human beings die rather than let their profit margins shrink. The scarcity was entirely an economic construct. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it requires us to fundamentally rethink the very definition of a starving nation.
Right. We usually think a starving nation is a barren wasteland.
But if a country produces enough to feed itself, yet the system allows the food to be hoarded by a few or exported for profit while the actual producers starve, then hunger is not an ecological failure.
It is an economic and political failure. It is manufactured. I hear you, but I have to push back on that a little because representing the listener here, it still feels counterintuitive. If land isn't the limiting factor, and if they are producing enough food, couldn't the problem still be the sheer number of people working the land?
How do you mean?
Even if the system is unfair, if you put 100 people in a room meant for 10, resources are going to feel tight. Is there just too high a population density for a society to function properly, regardless of who owns the land?
Is a very logical question, but the authors argue that the idea of high population density directly causing hunger is another profound myth.
And they use comparative global data to prove it.
For instance, they look at France and India. When you look at the amount of cultivated land available per person, France actually has the exact same population density per cultivated acre as India does.
They have the same ratio of people to farmland.
Yet you never hear about famines in France. France is considered an agricultural superpower.
That is wild. And then they look at China, right?
Yes, China has twice the population density per cultivated acre as India, double the crowding, And yet they managed to eradicate systemic hunger and mass famine.
And on the flip side, look at Bolivia. Bolivia is a massive country with a tiny population relative to its landmass. It has significantly more cultivable land per person than France does.
And yet, acute malnutrition is a daily, grueling reality for the majority of its population. The numbers simply do not correlate. Population density does not equal hunger.
So this raises an important question. If the sheer number of people isn't the cause of poverty, why are large rural populations so consistently viewed by economists and politicians as an obstacle or a burden?
The text argues that this perception is a symptom of a very specific economic system. When land is controlled by a tiny minority whose primary driving goal is to extract the maximum possible profit per worker, then human beings quickly become redundant.
The system doesn't measure success by how well the population is fed or how fully they are employed. It measures success strictly by the profit margin of the landowner.
The authors use an incredible historical analogy to explain this, showing how colonialism didn't just stumble upon poor people, it actually created marginalized people.
Right. Before colonial intervention in many of these areas, you had highly diverse farming systems. People worked year-round, growing a wide variety of crops that matured at different times, maintaining a constant cycle of labor and food production.
But colonial powers came in and converted those diverse sustainable systems into massive single-crop export plantations. They use Cuban sugar as an example, and it is fascinating.
Let's break down the Cuban sugar example because it perfectly illustrates the concept of redundancy.
When the Cuban economy was forcibly shifted almost entirely to sugar production to serve global markets, the labor requirements completely changed.
Sugarcane requires a massive, intense burst of labor during the harvest season, but very little labor for the rest of the year.
Suddenly, you had a situation where 500,000 workers were desperately needed for a few months to cut cane.
But for the remaining 9 months of the year, there was no work.
Those 500,000 people were suddenly classified as surplus population. They were unemployed and starving.
But they weren't naturally redundant. They hadn't multiplied too fast.
No, the economic system had simply been redesigned in a way that had no use for them for 3/4 of the year.
And what's terrifying is that this same dynamic of making people redundant is supercharged today by the myth of mechanization.
We are so conditioned to believe that bringing modern machinery, like giant tractors, into developing nations is a universal good.
It's progress, right? We think it saves labor and increases food.
The authors challenge that assumption entirely. Context is everything. In an industrialized nation with a severe labor shortage, say the American Midwest in the 20th century, a tractor creates necessary efficiency.
But in a developing nation that has a massive, willing, and desperate workforce, replacing human labor with machinery doesn't create social efficiency. It creates mass unemployment and deepens extreme poverty.
The statistics in the book on this are wild. They look at Pakistan and report that the push for full mechanization of large farms displaced between 600,000 and 700,000 workers.
Think about what that actually means. That's over 500,000 families who suddenly have zero income.
In Latin America, they cite an estimate that 2.5 million workers were displaced by the introduction of tractors.
Where do those people go? They don't just disappear.
They lose their only source of income, their only way to feed their families, and they are forced to migrate into urban slums, living in abject poverty.
Simply so, a few large landowners could increase their profit margins by eliminating the cost of wages. The tractor didn't make more food for the poor. It just made the rich richer and the poor landless.
To show that there is an alternative, the authors contrast this heavy mechanization approach with the path taken by China during their development.
Instead of treating their massive rural population as an obstacle to be displaced by heavy machinery, China viewed its people as its greatest resource.
They consciously chose not to heavily mechanize their agriculture immediately. Instead, they absorbed their massive rural population into decentralized, small-scale village workshops.
What did those workshops actually do? Were they just making trinkets?
Not at all. These workshops produce necessary agricultural tools, building materials, and basic consumer goods locally.
Okay, so this accomplished two massive things. First, it reduced the reliance on purely agricultural labor, diversifying the rural economy.
But crucially, it did it without pushing millions of people off the land and into urban slums to search for non-existent factory jobs.
They utilized their high population density as an engine for local rural development. They put the people to work building the infrastructure they needed to survive rather than buying a foreign tractor to put them out of work. If people aren't the problem, why do the poorest families have the most children?
This introduces the very complex topic of birth control and the brutal economics of family size.
It is a question that often comes loaded with immense judgment from the developed world. We look at a family in poverty with 8 kids, and we assume ignorance or lack of self-control.
But the text firmly asserts that for the extreme poor, having large families is a strict economic necessity.
It is a rational survival strategy, not a result of ignorance or an inability to understand consequence.
You have to put yourself in their shoes. In a system where you have absolutely no social security, no pension, no retirement funds, and no governmental safety net.
A child is your only economic asset.
Yes.
The book points out something that feels uncomfortable to say out loud, but is mathematically true in these rural agrarian settings. A child as young as 10 years old actually earns more than they consume.
In our society, a 10-year-old is an expense. In a rural peasant society, they are vital labor.
They gather firewood, they haul water from miles away, they tend to the grazing animals, they help with the grueling harvest.
For a family with no land and no capital, their only income is selling their physical labor. More kids simply mean more laborers to ensure the family's daily survival.
And we also have to address the desperate lack of bodily autonomy for women in these environments, which is a massive driver of population growth.
The authors cite a deeply revealing UN study conducted across 6 wildly different cultures, including places like Tunisia, Sudan, Kenya, Sri Lanka, Mexico, and Egypt.
The researchers found a heartbreaking commonality. Women overwhelmingly expressed utter exhaustion from constant back-to-back childbirth.
They did not want to be pregnant year after year. They knew the toll it took on their bodies and their existing children.
But they entirely lacked the social, legal, and economic power to refuse their husbands or to defy the immense cultural expectations placed upon them to produce heirs and laborers.
And the math of survival they're up against is just brutal. The book shares this striking mathematical model that really stopped me in my tracks.
Right.
They calculated that an Indian couple living in deep poverty must have 4.6 children just to have a 95% statistical chance of a single son surviving to adulthood to care for them in their old age.
Let me repeat that. You have to have almost 5 kids just to guarantee that one boy survives long enough to keep you from starving when you are too old to work the fields.
Because infant mortality from preventable diseases is so incredibly high, having a large number of children is essentially an insurance policy. It's the only way to ensure someone will be there.
This raises an important question about how the West typically approaches family planning and foreign aid in the developing world. The text presents a very strong critique of traditional Western birth control programs.
It argues that simply flying in and flooding rural areas with contraceptive pills or enforcing aggressive sterilization campaigns without simultaneously improving healthcare, sanitation, or economic security is not just ineffective, it is actively dangerous to these families.
Right, because if infant mortality remains at those staggering heights, convincing a couple to undergo permanent sterilization is asking them to take a massive, life-threatening economic risk.
Imagine you convince a young couple to get sterilized after they have 2 kids, and then a year later, a waterborne cholera outbreak sweeps through the village and both of those children die.
That couple is now left with absolutely nothing for their old age. They are doomed to starve. You cannot ask people to stop having children if you haven't fixed the conditions that kill those children.
The book proves this point by comparing 2 really contrasting examples of how population growth actually stabilizes. It proves that you don't need draconian coercive measures if you simply fix the underlying economic insecurity.
They look at the state of Kerala in India and compare it to China.
In Kerala, the population remained very poor. They still had low per capita incomes. But the local government chose to invest heavily in social infrastructure.
High literacy rates, especially for women, equitable food distribution through fair-price shops, and highly accessible rural healthcare.
And what was the result? Just by giving people a baseline of security and health, the birth rate in Kerala dropped from 37 per thousand down to 27 per thousand in just 10 years.
They didn't force anyone. People just naturally chose to have fewer kids because they knew the ones they had would survive.
Exactly. And in China, the mechanism was different, but the result was the same. The establishment of the commune system provided guaranteed old age security.
The commune promised to take care of you when you were old, and it integrated women fully into the paid workforce.
When parents knew they wouldn't starve in their old age if they didn't have a son to provide for them, the birth rates absolutely plummeted.
They went from 32 per thousand down to between 20 and 25 per thousand in just 5 years.
The authors argue powerfully that population growth naturally stabilizes when wealth, security, and healthcare are distributed equitably. When people feel secure, the panic of survival lifts, and they choose smaller families.
So what does this all mean? If population isn't the root cause of hunger, is it the root cause of environmental destruction? Because that's the other side of the too many people argument.
We are constantly bombarded with documentaries and articles telling us that overpopulation is destroying the planet, chopping down the rainforests, and turning grasslands into deserts.
The text tackles this environmental scapegoating head-on.
The authors argue that environmental degradation in the developing world is overwhelmingly caused by land monopoly and export-driven agriculture, not by the sheer number of peasants trying to scratch out a living.
The peasants are the victims of the destruction, not the architects of it.
The examples they give to illustrate this are just heart-wrenching. They look at El Salvador, which is a densely populated country with very mountainous, rugged terrain.
Naturally, the best, most fertile and flattest lands are down in the volcanic valleys. But who owns them?
A tiny elite oligarchy. And they use those Prime Valley lands almost exclusively for large-scale export crops. Sugar, cotton, and beef for the international market.
So where do the local peasants go to grow their own corn and beans to survive? They are violently forced out of the valleys and pushed onto the marginal, incredibly steep hillsides.
And the text describes the physical reality of this. You have desperate farmers trying to plant crops with digging sticks on 77-degree inclines.
Try to picture a 77-degree slope. It is basically a cliff.
It is physically, geologically impossible to farm sustainably on a slope that steep. There is nothing to hold the soil in place.
So when the heavy tropical rains come, the result is inevitable. Massive, catastrophic soil erosion. The nutrient-rich topsoil just washes away down the mountain. The hillside is ruined.
Then the peasants have no choice but to abandon that dead hillside, move further up the mountain, slash and burn another patch of forest, and start the doomed process over again just to survive.
And the authors present this really cynical view, and we are looking at their analysis of the political situation here, that governments often use this resulting environmental destruction as a highly convenient safety valve.
By pointing at the eroded hillsides and blaming overpopulation and ignorant peasant farming methods, the government avoids having to address the real explosive political issue.
The real solution would be taking the prime, flat valley land back from the wealthy elites and redistributing it to the people who actually need it to grow food.
In fact, the text points out that this exact boiling tension over land peasants being forced off the good land and having nowhere to go was a primary catalyst for the famous 1969 soccer war between El Salvador and Honduras.
It wasn't about a soccer game. It was about desperate, landless people crossing borders to find dirt they could live on.
We see this exact pattern of prime land being hijacked for foreign tastes repeated globally.
In the Caribbean, as we mentioned earlier, the best land is used for sugarcane and bananas. But the book is a specific example in Haiti that is truly galling.
They describe a situation where Haitian peasants are literally starving on eroded, deforested mountainsides, again, pushed up there by land inequality.
Meanwhile, down in the prime, beautifully irrigated valley lands, lush crops are being grown. But not for Haitians. Those crops are grown to feed thousands of pigs.
And those pigs aren't even for the local market. They were being raised, slaughtered, and turned into sausages, specifically for a Chicago-based company called Serve Best Foods.
The environmental ruin of Haiti's mountains isn't because there are naturally too many Haitians. It's because the good land was hijacked by foreign corporate interests for American breakfast meats.
And then there is the Amazon rainforest in Brazil. This is probably the biggest environmental touchstone we have.
We are always told the Amazon is being cleared because Brazil has a booming population, they are desperate for room to live, and the poor need land to farm.
But the book points out the demographic reality. Brazil actually has plenty of land per capita. It is a massive country.
The Brazilian military government, at the time of the book's writing in the late 70s, wasn't clearing the Amazon to relieve population pressure or help the poor.
They were giving away chunks of the rainforest the size of small European countries to wealthy domestic elites and multinational corporations.
The scale of the giveaway is almost unimaginable. The text cites an American billionaire named D.K. Ludwig, who was essentially gifted a 3 million-acre estate right in the middle of the Amazon.
3 million acres.
Companies like Volkswagen and Nestle were also given massive, sprawling tracts of virgin rainforest. And they weren't building sustainable farms for poor Brazilians.
They were aggressively clearing the ancient forests to create vast pastures for export beef or to harvest timber.
The description in the book of how they physically cleared the jungle is apocalyptic. They didn't just log it, they used giant D9 tractors, these massive military-grade earth-moving machines.
They would take two of these enormous tractors, attach a massive, incredibly heavy steel chain between them with a giant steel ball in the middle to weigh it down, and the two tractors would just drive parallel to each other through the dense jungle.
The chain would violently rip up every single tree, every bush, every living thing in its path, tearing the roots right out of the ground. It completely, irrevocably destroyed the thin, fragile topsoil of the rainforest.
And here's the absolute kicker.
Mm.
This massive, violent destruction created almost zero jobs for the local population.
D.K. Ledwig's 3-million-acre estate, an area the size of Connecticut, was expected to employ only a handful of permanent workers to watch the cattle.
It was environmental devastation purely for corporate profit, completely disconnected from any legitimate population needs.
The book also deconstructs a very pervasive racist myth about Africa, the overgrazing nomad.
For decades, Western observers, ecologists, and aid workers have blamed nomadic herdsmen in the Sahel region for the expansion of the Sahara Desert.
The narrative was that these ignorant nomads keep too many animals for prestige. They overgraze the fragile grasslands, and they turn the savanna into a desert.
But the authors dig into the anthropological history and show how completely backwards that narrative is. Historically, nomads maintained a brilliant, delicate, and highly sustainable ecological balance.
They didn't just keep cows, they kept mixed herds, camels, goats, sheep, and cattle.
And there's a biological genius to this. Because different animals eat different types of vegetation at different heights. Goats eat shrubs, sheep eat low grass, camels eat high leaves. A mixed herd doesn't decimate the landscape the way a massive single-species herd of just cattle does.
Furthermore, they constantly migrated. They followed the sporadic rains, grazing an area lightly and then moving on, allowing the perennial grasses time to recover and regrow. It was a perfectly adapted system for a harsh environment.
So what broke this delicate balance? The text points directly to colonial interference and later misguided Western aid.
First, French colonial authorities wanted to monetize the region, so they imposed head taxes on the nomads.
Because the tax legally had to be paid in French currency, the nomads were violently forced out of their traditional barter economy and thrust into a cash economy.
The only way for a nomad to get cash to pay the tax and avoid prison was to sell animals at market, which forced them to breed and expand their herds well beyond what they traditionally kept just to meet the tax burden.
And then the final fatal blow came from Western aid agencies. With the absolute best of intentions, but a total ignorance of the local ecology, these agencies went into the Sahel and used modern drilling equipment to dig deep, permanent, year-round water wells.
It sounds like a great idea, right? Give them permanent water. But this completely broke the natural ancient migration cycle.
The herds no longer had to move to find water, so they all naturally gathered around these new permanent wells.
And this is where the disaster happens. While there was now infinite water from the deep aquifer, there wasn't infinite grass.
The massive tax-inflated herds stayed by the wells year-round. They ate every single blade of grass, they ate the roots, and their hooves trampled the fragile topsoil into fine dust.
They literally created localized mini-deserts that stretch 40 to 50 miles wide around every single well.
So when the inevitable cyclical droughts hit, the animals didn't die of thirst. They died of starvation, because the pasture around the permanent water had been completely annihilated by the wells.
It was a human-engineered disaster brought on by taxes and technology, masquerading as a natural environmental collapse caused by ignorant locals.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it links the destruction of land for export crops to the global manipulation of food prices.
Wait, if we are clearing the Amazon for export beef and destroying the Sahel with cash economy pressures, how does all of this connect to the food you and I buy? Because if these countries are exporting so much food, shouldn't global food prices be dropping? That brings us to the price scare and the corporate illusion of shortage.
The text focuses heavily on the massive global panic known as the food crisis of 1972 and 1973. If you were alive then, or if you've studied modern economic history, you remember the shockwaves.
Prices for basic staples like wheat and corn skyrocketed globally almost overnight.
The prevailing media narrative was apocalyptic. Pundits declared that the world had finally hit its absolute carrying capacity, that human population had outstripped the Earth's production, and we were entering a dark new era of permanent structural scarcity.
But I was genuinely shocked reading the source's claim about this era. The authors state unequivocally that the 1972 crisis was not a natural event.
It wasn't a sudden failure of the Earth's soils to produce.
It was the deliberate, calculated result of food power strategies employed by the United States government and a handful of massive monopolistic grain corporations.
To understand how they pulled this off, we have to look at the mechanics of commodity price cycles. Agriculture is uniquely prone to extreme boom and bust cycles.
It works like this. When the market price for wheat is high, every farmer wants to cash in, so everyone plants wheat.
When harvest comes, there's a massive glut of wheat on the market. Because supply is so high, prices absolutely crash. The farmers go broke.
So the next year, because prices are so low, nobody wants to plant wheat, which leads to a severe shortage, which drives prices right back up to the stratosphere.
The authors argue that this violent cycle primarily benefits massive corporate middlemen, the grain trading giants, who have the capital to buy low during a glut and sell high during a shortage.
Meanwhile, it constantly hurts both the actual farmers going bankrupt and the end consumers facing inflation.
And according to the text, the U.S. government didn't try to smooth this cycle out. They actively manipulated it to create a shortage.
In the late 60s and early 70s, the U.S. found itself sitting on a massive historic wheat surplus. This surplus was keeping global wheat prices low, which was bad for the profit margins of the big grain exporters.
So what did the government do? They literally paid farmers not to grow food.
They used taxpayer money to pay farmers to take perfectly good agricultural land out of production in order to artificially restrict the global supply and drive the price up.
The scale of this intentional suppression is breathtaking. The authors detail how, leading up to 1972, President Richard Nixon and his agriculture secretary, Earl Butz, took an additional 5 million acres out of production.
To put that abstract number in perspective, 5 million acres is an area roughly the size of all the cultivable cropland in the entire United Kingdom.
Imagine the entire agricultural output of the UK just sitting idle, growing weeds, by direct government decree during a supposed global food crisis.
And at the exact same time they were suppressing domestic production, they executed this massive secret deal. The U.S. subsidized massive, unprecedented, and largely unpublicized wheat sales to the Soviet Union.
And the Soviets weren't even buying this massive amount of grain to feed starving citizens. They were buying it to feed their livestock, to increase meat production for their urban elites.
The result of this two-pronged engineered strategy was dramatic and immediate. Global food reserves, the safety net for the world, plummeted from a comfortable 95-day supply down to a terrifyingly thin reserve of under 30 days.
This sudden drop created a massive global panic, which did exactly what it was designed to do. It skyrocketed prices to record highs. The corporations made a fortune.
But the authors present a crucial myth-busting statistic. Statistically, physically, the world actually produced more wheat per capita in the crisis years of 1972 and 1973 than it did a decade earlier in 1960.
The food existed. The scarcity was entirely engineered to maximize corporate profits and leverage geopolitical power.
The book also describes this horrifying phenomenon that perfectly encapsulates the sickness of this system. Farmers, trapped in this ruthless market logic, will literally let perfect crops rot in the field.
The text notes that between 1959 and 1973, over 1 billion pounds of fruit were left to rot in American fields. Not because they were diseased or because there wasn't a hungry person who could eat an apple.
They let 1 billion pounds rot simply because harvesting the surplus would have flooded the market and lowered prices too much. The economic logic of the system dictated that they would rather let 1 billion pounds of food rot into the soil than let the price drop by a few cents.
This raises a massive, glaring paradox that the authors highlight brilliantly.
If we are artificially suppressing food production to keep prices up, why are we simultaneously pouring millions of tons of toxic chemicals onto our fields under the guise of feeding the world?
That is such a crucial pivot. It exposes the whole lie. And it leads us right into the issue of food versus promoting poisons, which the authors bluntly call the pesticide trap.
We are constantly, relentlessly told that heavy industrial pesticide use is a necessary evil.
We are told that without drenching our crops in toxic chemicals, insects would eat everything, harvests would fail, and billions of human beings would starve. It's pitched as a moral imperative to use poison.
But the authors challenge that assumption from the ground up. First, they clarify a massive misconception about where these chemicals actually go.
Most of the pesticides used in the developing world are not being sprayed on staple food crops grown by peasants for local consumption.
They are being sprayed heavily on large-scale export crops like cotton, bananas, coffee, and luxury fruits, destined for wealthy markets in the US and Europe.
The chemicals aren't feeding the poor. They are strictly protecting the aesthetic quality and profit margins of export commodities.
And the ecological blowback of this chemical warfare is terrifying. It's not just a little collateral damage, it creates a worse problem. The book describes this phenomenon called the pesticide treadmill.
Let me break down how this works biologically, because it's fascinating in a very dark way. You have a field of cotton, and you have pests. You spray the field with a highly toxic pesticide. It's incredibly effective. You kill 99% of the pests.
But killing 100% is biologically impossible. That remaining 1% that survives didn't just get lucky.
They survive because they have a random genetic mutation that makes them naturally resistant to the chemical.
Exactly. And meanwhile, that same broad-spectrum pesticide you sprayed has completely wiped out all the natural predators in the ecosystem, the birds, the wasps, the beneficial spiders, that used to naturally keep the pest population in check.
So now look at your field. You have 0 natural predators left and a small surviving population of pests that are genetically immune to your poison. What happens?
The resistant pests breed explosively, with nothing to eat them.
By the next season, the farmer has a massive infestation of superbugs. So they have to spray more often in heavier doses with even stronger, more toxic chemicals just to achieve the same result they got last year.
They're trapped on a chemical treadmill, running faster just to stay in place while the environment collapses around them.
The case studies the book provides to back this up are chilling. In Nicaragua, the authors report that cotton farmers were trapped so badly on this pesticide treadmill that they were spraying their fields up to 50 times in a single growing season.
50 times! It was a world record for chemical application. And despite absolutely drenching the land in poison, crop yields still dropped because the pests were so resistant.
But it gets worse. The chemicals didn't just stay on the cotton. They killed off all the natural predators of local mosquitoes in the surrounding wetlands.
Without those predators, the mosquito population exploded out of control, causing a massive, deadly resurgence of malaria across the region. The desperate attempt to save a cash crop for export ended up killing local people through a mosquito-borne plague.
And the human cost of the chemicals themselves is severe and deeply unethical. The authors document how the U.S. and other industrialized nations routinely export chemicals to the Third World that have been explicitly banned domestically due to extreme health risks.
They highlight the horrific case of a pesticide called phosphel.
This was a chemical that severely attacks the central nervous system.
Oh my God.
It was manufactured in a plant in the U.S. It was so toxic that it caused severe paralysis and permanent neurological damage in the American factory workers producing it.
So that's where the nickname came from.
Exactly. The damage was so widespread they were grimly nicknamed Phosphel zombies.
So the U.S. government banned it for domestic use.
Yes, but despite knowing the horrific, paralyzing effects, the chemical companies simply pivoted. They continued to manufacture it and exported Phosphel to farmers in the Third World.
Including Egypt, where it caused mass poisonings, paralysis, and death among illiterate farmers who couldn't read the warning labels.
And perhaps the most maddening part of all this chemical use is when you look at why a lot of it is sprayed. We think it's to save the plant from dying.
But a huge percentage of the pesticides sprayed on our food aren't even used to increase the yield or protect the health of the plant. They're used purely for cosmetics. They're makeup for fruit.
Yes, the authors deeply analyze how massive marketing boards like Sunkist have spent millions on advertising to essentially train consumers to demand flawless fruit.
We've been psychologically conditioned to think a tiny, harmless brown blemish on the skin of an orange means the fruit is rotten inside. It's not. It's just a surface mark.
But because consumers demand perfection, farmers are forced to drench orchards in highly toxic chemicals just to keep the skin looking pretty for the supermarket display.
The tomato example blew my mind.
Right, the processing tomatoes.
Yeah, these are tomatoes that are literally going to be boiled and mashed up, turned into an unrecognizable red paste or ketchup.
Exactly.
But the text points out that 2/3 of the pesticides used on them are just to prevent a specific type of worm. And does this worm destroy the crop? No. It only affects the visual appearance of the tomato skin.
It leaves a little scar.
Right. We are literally poisoning the soil, poisoning the groundwater, and exposing farm workers to neurotoxins. So our violently mashed tomato paste comes from a tomato that used to look pretty before we pulverized it. It is absolute madness.
But the authors don't just point out the flaws and leave you depressed. They present the highly effective, systematically suppressed alternative, integrated pest management, or IPM.
It turns out we don't actually need all these chemicals to produce massive yields.
IPM relies on deep, granular understanding of the local ecology rather than just blanketing it with poison. It uses intelligent crop rotation, the introduction of natural predators, and intense manual monitoring to catch problems early.
The authors look at China's implementation of this. China utilized its massive rural population by training thousands of barefoot ag doctors.
These were young people, often teenagers, who physically walked the fields every single day, manually scouting for the very first early warning signs of pest infestations or disease.
Because they had eyes on the ground and caught outbreaks immediately in small patches, they could target them specifically with manual removal or very localized, minimal spraying.
This labor-intensive method reduced catastrophic crop damage from things like wheat rust and rice borers to under 1%. Without destroying the ecosystem.
And before anyone says, well, that only works in a communist system with cheap labor, the book notes that it was proven to work in the United States, too.
In Arizona, researchers set up a program where farmers used trained scouts to monitor commercial cotton fields in the exact same way.
The results were undeniable. They reduced their pesticide costs tenfold. They saved a fortune, and they maintained the exact same yields as the farmers who were spraying blindly.
But, and this is the dark, monopolistic side of the industry, the chemical companies saw this massive success not as a breakthrough, but as a direct threat to their core profit model.
If farmers use 10 times less pesticide, the chemical companies lose billions. The text reports that these chemical conglomerates actively, heavily pressured the university involved, threatening to pull funding to force them to pull their scientists off the IPM program.
The chemical agriculture system doesn't promote its own products. It actively, aggressively suppresses sustainable, cheaper alternatives.
Here's where it gets really interesting, linking the systemic failure of chemical agriculture to the ultimate systemic failure, famines.
This brings us to the history of famines and the realization that they are overwhelmingly a human-made disaster.
We tend to think of famines as acts of God. It's almost biblical. A drought happens, the rains fail, the crops wither, and a famine is just the tragic, unavoidable, inevitable result of nature's cruelty.
But the authors completely and utterly deconstruct that idea. The central philosophical argument here is profound. A drought is a natural meteorological phenomenon. It is a lack of rain.
But a famine mass starvation is a human social phenomenon. Society's structure, how it distributes wealth, who owns the land, and where the resources flow during a crisis determines whether a lack of rain translates into mass human death.
Nature causes the drought. Humans cause the famine.
We are going to look closely at the author's analysis of colonial history here, because it's absolutely vital to their argument. According to Lappé and Collins, the British and French empires didn't just exploit colonies, they systematically dismantled ancient, robust, drought-resistant agricultural systems in order to extract wealth.
And they compared two massive historical events to prove their point. The 1943 Bengal famine under British rule and China's response to a massive drought in the 1970s.
Let's start with Bengal in 1943. This is one of the darkest chapters of British colonial history. At least 1.5 million people died of starvation.
But the text argues forcefully that this wasn't just a natural disaster caused by a bad harvest.
While the people of Bengal starved in the streets, the British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, actively ordered military troops in the region to live off the local land, further depleting the already scarce local food resources.
But more shockingly, during the height of the starvation, rice was actively, officially exported out of starving Bengal by the ton.
Why? Because people in other parts of the empire and the military had the cash money to pay for it, while the dying Bengalis did not. The free market dictated that food flows toward money, not toward hunger.
And the authors traced the root of that disaster back decades before the actual drought hit. British policy had systematically forced Bengali farmers, through taxes and coercion, to stop growing their traditional varied food crops.
Instead, they were forced to grow cash crops like cotton and oilseeds for export to feed the empire's industrial engine. They forcibly dismantled the local food security net.
So when a crisis finally hit, The people had nothing in reserve to fall back on. They were growing cotton while they were starving for rice.
Now, contrast that horrific failure with China in the early 1970s. Historically, before the mid-20th century, China was known globally as the land of famine. They had suffered catastrophic, multi-million casualty famines for centuries whenever the rains failed.
In 1972 and 1973, a massive, severe global drought hit China. It was one of the worst, most sustained weather events in decades. Yet, despite the meteorological disaster, nobody starved. There was no mass famine. Why?
Because, as the book details, the Chinese population hadn't just been sitting around waiting for the rain. They had spent the previous years manually building massive, countrywide infrastructure to mitigate disaster.
They mobilized millions of people to build the high river control system. They created 106 billion cubic meters of reservoirs to store water. They hand-dug 700,000 deep wells to access groundwater.
They used their massive population density not as an excuse for poverty, but as a workforce to literally drought-proof their agriculture.
But even more importantly than the infrastructure, the authors argue, was the social structure. The egalitarian distribution system of the communes meant that whatever food was produced, even during a severe drought, was shared equitably among the population.
The pain and the shortage were distributed evenly, so nobody had to die.
Finally, the authors analyzed the devastating Sahel drought in Africa during the early 1970s to really hammer this point home. The images from the Sahel during this time, starving children with distended bellies, dead cattle baking in the cracked mud, shocked the conscience of the world.
It was universally, unquestioningly blamed by the Western media on the total failure of the rains and the encroaching desert.
But the text reveals a deeply disturbing, hidden economic reality happening right alongside the starvation. During the absolute worst, most deadly years of the Sahel drought, the region was exporting record amounts of agricultural products.
They were shipping massive quantities of cotton, beef, fish, and fresh vegetables straight to Europe.
The value of the luxury agricultural exports leaving the starving Sahel during the famine was 3 times the value of all the basic grain that was being imported for international relief.
They were shipping out high-value, nutrient-dense food to European supermarkets, while simultaneously receiving cheap grain as pity charity from the rest of the world.
And we have to ask, where did the massive amounts of money from those European exports go? It didn't go to the starving nomads or peasants.
The authors note that the local political and military elites used the foreign exchange cash earned from exporting food to import luxury goods.
They bought imported European cars, high-end air conditioners, and expensive alcohol, all while their countrymen died in the dust.
Meanwhile, just like we saw in the Bangladesh example, local grain merchants hoarded what little domestic grain was left. They locked it away, waiting for the peak hunger months to sell it back to the desperate, starving peasants at 300% markups.
The drought was a natural event. The famine was entirely a product of an export-driven economy and extreme unchecked inequality.
The authors pull everything together with a really powerful, undeniably clear conclusion. Nations can feed themselves. The Earth is not running out of capacity. We are not hitting the limits of the lifeboat.
But nations are prevented from feeding themselves by a historical legacy of colonial extraction.
And that colonial system hasn't disappeared. It hasn't been relegated to the history books. It has just been seamlessly, quietly replaced by modern corporate agriculture, multinational grain monopolies, and corrupt local elites who prioritize dollar exports over feeding their own neighbors.
Which brings us to the ultimate takeaway for you, the listener. The core message of the manufacturing of hunger is that scarcity is, by and large, a carefully constructed myth.
It is a powerful, pervasive narrative used by those in power to justify a deeply unequal global food system.
Overpopulation, bad weather, a lack of chemical fertilizers, these are symptoms, or more often, they are incredibly convenient scapegoats. They are not the root causes of global hunger.
The true root cause is the monopolization of power, the monopolization of land, and an economic system that values commodities over human calories.
After unpacking all of this, after really diving deep into these historical examples, it completely changes the way you have to read the news.
It changes how you see the world. The next time you see a headline about a famine or a food shortage or environmental collapse, the authors urge you not to just accept the surface narrative.
Don't just ask, what was the weather like? Or how many people live in that country?
Instead, you should immediately be asking, who actually owns the prime agricultural land in that country? And where are the crops they're growing actually being exported to?
It's a profound shift in perspective. It moves you from viewing hunger as an unavoidable, tragic act of nature to viewing it as a solvable, tangible issue of social justice, land reform, and economic policy.
And I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over on your own. It builds on everything we've discussed today, and it might make you look at your own country's foreign policy differently.
We've seen how export economies and local elites create the conditions for famines.
So, what does this mean for modern international food aid? When we see a crisis on the news and wealthy Western nations proudly ship thousands of tons of surplus, heavily subsidized grain to a developing nation, are we actually solving the root problem of hunger?
Or by flooding their local fragile markets with free or artificially cheap foreign grain, are we just instantly bankrupting and undercutting their local farmers?
Are we driving them out of business, forcing them off their land, and deepening the very dependency and colonial legacy that caused the vulnerability and hunger in the first place?
It is a heavy, uncomfortable question.
But after spending this time reading the source material, it's a question we absolutely cannot afford to ignore. Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us today. We hope it encourages you to question the narratives around scarcity in your everyday life and to look a little closer at the invisible systems that feed or fail to feed our world.